A quick succession of busy nothings. A Jane Austen mashup written by Jayne Bamber. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. Chapter 1. Mary Crawford smiled down at the letter in her hand. She savoured a moment of warm affection for her favourite cousin, and then let her imagination take flight at the pleasant possibilities brought to mind by Elizabeth's information. Mary had been content enough in London since she and her brother Henry had decamped from Mansfield Park. But she was not so fully settled that she could not entertain the notion of exchanging their present situation for a better one. After passing a few cosy nights with their aunt and uncle Gardiner in Gracechurch Street, Mary and Henry had gone to a more fashionable neighbourhood. They had accepted an invitation from one of Henry's friends from Cambridge, and were now residing in Mayfair with Mr. Charles Bingley. Unfortunately, so too was that gentleman's preening and pernicious sister. Miss Caroline Bingley had seemed upon first meeting to be just the sort of woman Mary could desire as a friend, and the circumstances of their acquaintance might easily give way to a very intimate and advantageous friendship. This impression had, in the space of a single day, given way to a sort of competitive civility that kept the two women just polite enough to one another, but precluded any possibility for real warmth betwixt them. Miss Bingley had not yet exhausted the subject that had nearly soured the entire supper. She had quit her instrument as the gentlemen joined them in the drawing-room, and resumed her discourse directly. The haughty creature appeared unaware that her veneer of genteel refinement fooled nobody. Her conversation was purely complaint. "You cannot seriously be considering another misadventure into country life, Charles, after Kellynch. After such tedium, such tiresome neighbours, such a total want of refinement. Surely London must be infinitely more preferable." Mr. Bingley frowned, his brow knit in confusion. "I liked Kellynch very much, and all the neighbourhood. The house was pleasant, and the company was some of the finest I have ever enjoyed. The Musgroves—" "The Musgroves," Miss Bingley scoffed. "Miss Musgrove is pretty and sweet enough, but her family is as inconsequential as her fortune and accomplishments. She is nothing to, say, Georgiana Darcy, who is her superior in any number of ways." Miss Bingley cast a beguiling look at Mr. Darcy, who had been her first object all evening. Almost as soon as he had entered the house, Miss Bingley had singled him out as the recipient of her wasted efforts. She had made it abundantly clear to Mary that she had a prior claim on the handsome, stoic gentleman, and would not allow a newcomer any chance at charming him out of her snares. Indeed, Miss Bingley had marked her territory with so little endeavour at subtlety that Mary wondered how poor Mr. Darcy had survived the mortification of it. Even now he made no acknowledgment of Miss Bingley's desperate attempt to ingratiate herself. As ever, Mr. Bingley appeared not to notice anything unpleasant. "I liked all the Musgroves very much. Miss Anne Elliot, too, was very agreeable. Poor creature! It is a shame she is not more handsome. There's a spinster in the making. Miss Elizabeth Elliot is fashionable and elegant, I shall grant you, but her sisters, and her father, ugh!" "I had thought Miss Elizabeth Elliot to be older than her sister Anne," Mr. Bingley replied. "She is charming, but I suspect she is deliberately cruel to her sisters. You know I do not like that sort of thing." "You only add strength to my argument that these country chits and their ignorant relations are decidedly beneath us," Miss Bingley huffed, conveniently shifting her previous opinion. That they are both nearly 30 and unmarried only proves how dreadfully isolated they are in that part of the country. Is that what you wish for me, Charles? Mary once again peered over at Mr. Bingley, who blanched at the notion of his sister remaining unwed and at home at such an advanced age, no doubt plaguing him twice over. He was too affable, and perhaps too accustomed to his sister's vitriol, to express what he must really think of her remaining a spinster destined to harangue him. Instead, he shrugged his shoulders as he spoke. "Not at all. I hope you will consider it all very seriously. You are always far too hasty. You think of your own amusement, but think of me, brother. I wish to do as Louisa has done, but I can hardly show myself to advantage in some remote backwater. My fine schooling and accomplishments, my talent for playing hostess on your behalf, my ease in society, is all this to be wasted in such desolation?" Again Miss Bingley looked to Mr. Darcy, who had become transfixed by the book he had been pretending to read for the last quarter hour. Mr. Bingley began to falter. Perhaps the society to be had at Kellynch was not the finest or most lively, but surely life in the country is not so confined and unvarying as a general rule. I mean to try again to better myself in learning to manage a estate, for our father dearly wished me to some day purchase one. As his sister had done, Mr. Bingley began to look around the room for an ally. Miss Bingley tipped her chin up, all sceptical snobbery. "I hope you shall find an estate worthy of the superior company we are sure to keep. Let it be near London, that our friends may join us. Nothing too provincial. A place with neighbours worth knowing, where we might still enjoy some semblance of sophistication in the local society." Henry had mirrored Mr. Darcy's charade of reading as Mary perused her letter. He looked up now, giving Mary a wry smile. He was poised to speak, but Mary spoke first. She set aside her letter and moved from the cosy corner toward Mr. Bingley, as she addressed Mr. Bingley. "I believe I know of such a place. Indeed, it was mentioned in the letter I have just had from Hertfordshire. Netherfield Park. How charming it sounds! I understand it is a spacious home with a large park, and boasts a quaint village and a very genteel neighbourhood. My own faithful correspondent there dines with 24 families. Surely this must satisfy any demands of agreeable society." Miss Bingley appeared ready to argue before her brother could reply, but Mary was too quick for both of them. "I commend you, of course, on your first priority, in the admirable endeavour of becoming a landowner. Surely all your friends must applaud that which would raise your station, and what a boon to your sister's prospects that would be. I understand you are his closest friend, Mr. Darcy. What say you to such a scheme for felicity?"
"As to Bingley's felicity, his disposition guarantees it, whether in town or elsewhere,"
Mr. Darcy said, gracing Mary with the longest speech he had made all evening. He flattered her further by continuing,
"But the improvement of understanding in managing a large and prosperous estate, and the satisfaction to be had in doing so, must count as a strong inducement."
Mr. Darcy, Mary noted, was too grand himself to remark on his friend's lower station as the son of a tradesman. Mary herself could not object to it in such an instance as this, for his fortune and connections far outweighed his origins, and she herself had an uncle in trade. Still, she could not resist needling Miss Bingley, for that lady seemed in want of a humbling reminder. "I am glad we are in agreement, sir. I have no doubt Mr. Bingley will apply himself so happily to the business of running an estate, that he should have no trouble at all in finding himself accepted by the landowners of many generations." Henry looked askance at Mary, as if she might have offended his friend, but Mr. Bingley responded with a wide grin. "Quite so. It is just what I wish. I should be very pleased with myself if I should do half so well as you do with Pemberley, Darcy, though I know I shall never find an estate nearly as grand." Miss Bingley was ready with a litany of rehearsed praise for Pemberley, which Mary had heard before, as that lady had monologued possessively about their esteemed guest prior to his arrival that evening. Moved by the satisfaction of having aroused a modicum of agreement from Mr. Darcy, after Miss Bingley had failed to do so, Mary pressed her advantage. "Let Netherfield Park be your next endeavour, dear Mr. Bingley. Henry and I have heard naught but praise of Hertfordshire from our cousins who reside there. And what a fine adviser you have in Mr. Darcy. Between him and Henry, you shall have plenty of experienced advice at your disposal. And if we were to make a small party of it, Miss Bingley, I dare say it should satisfy your penchant for hostessing. I, too, have only just returned to London, but I can think of nothing so pleasant as a country manor." Mr. Bingley nodded, and smiled with palpable enthusiasm at her encouragement. "Very good. Capital. I think it a perfect plan, if you should all like to accompany us. We shall be a very merry party, and recommend ourselves to all the neighbours. Perhaps I might even purchase the place if it suits me. Indeed, it is just what I should wish. I shall speak to my solicitor, and arrange to see the place directly. I am most exceedingly obliged to you, Miss Crawford." This was just as Mary wished. Mr. Bingley, and even his sombre friend Mr. Darcy, possessed a great many of the qualities that Mary believed a gentleman ought to have, and she had secured herself an opportunity to come to know each of the gentlemen better, and to allow them to strengthen their own budding appreciation for her myriad abilities and allurements. That the furtherance of such a fortuitous acquaintance should take place so very near the new home of her friends from Mansfield Park, Mary was sure must be to her benefit. She was resolved that she would not allow it to be otherwise, and at once felt confident in her capability to manage the blending of her former companions and her new prospects, and all along with her favourite cousins, whose amiable affection must surely only enhance Mary's desirability in the estimation of her quarry. The Netherfield scheme was discussed at length amongst their party for the rest of the evening, with even the reticent Mr. Darcy achieving something akin to animation, as he agreed to be one of the party. Mary had a great deal to say on the subject, and did well in strengthening Mr. Bingley's resolve against his sister's lingering objections. Once her object was attained, there was much for Mary to consider, though she managed to reach the happy conclusion she desired by the end of the night. She determined that between Netherfield and Purvis Lodge there should be gentlemen enough to satisfy herself and her cousins at Longbourn, and their mercenary mother. Unburdened by the odious objection of considering Jayne and Elizabeth as potential rivals, it was with absolute optimism that Mary woke the next morning and penned a carefully crafted letter to Lady Bertram. Chapter 2. The Bennets were among the first to call on the Bertrams at Purvis Lodge. Mrs. Bennet and all her daughters were received very warmly by Lady Bertram, who was of such a supine disposition as to raise no objection to receiving a great abundance of noisy strangers. The baronet and his sons were not at home, but even this could not vex Mrs. Bennet in the face of such a welcome. Lady Bertram expressed as much pleasure as her indolence would allow in making the acquaintance of her new neighbours, and betrayed none of the surprise that Jayne and Elizabeth had been expecting in discovering all 4 daughters to be out at once. She agreed they were all sweet, pretty girls, and declared that they should always be welcome to visit her, so long as they did not tease her pug. Her own daughters, Lady Bertram informed them, were travelling at present. Her eldest, the new Mrs. Rushworth, had just married a gentleman of large fortune. Miss Julia Bertram had, at the bride's request, accompanied her sister on the honeymoon tour. Mrs. Bennet knew just how to act. She congratulated her new friend heartily on such an eligible match for the eldest daughter, which must surely be of great benefit to the younger as well. And then she went on to suggest that Lady Bertram must be in want of feminine society. "What a comfort it shall be to you," Mrs. Bennet mused to Lady Bertram, "when your sons marry, for then you shall have the delight of amiable daughters about you again. My own bring me such consolation, and so would my dear Mary if she had lived, for my nerves are often in such a state." Jane and Elizabeth exchanged a look of mortification at their mother's want of subtlety, but Lady Bertram merely nodded her assent. Mrs. Bennet pressed on, asking what sort of young men Tom and Edmund Bertram were, and inquiring about their tastes, pursuits, and inclinations. "I hope they are fond of dancing," Mrs. Bennet cried, when her curiosity had been satisfied. "There is to be an assembly in Meryton next week. My girls are all splendid dancers. And what a fine way for you to become acquainted with the neighbourhood. I dare say you shall be very welcome indeed. I am sure we have been very dull since the Lucases went away, and Netherfield Park has been empty for so long." Mrs. Bennet paused, seeming to recollect herself, for she was hardly presenting her environs in a favourable light. She shifted her posture, and said with some attempt at gravity, "It has been so hard, being the first family in the neighbourhood these 4 years at least. But now you all are come, how merry we shall be." Lady Bertram made a brief and gracious reply, seeming as unaffected by Mrs. Bennet's declarations as by the effusions that followed, for Lydia and Kitty could not keep silent once the possibility of dancing had been mentioned. Lady Bertram listened to their silliness as tolerantly as she had borne Mrs. Bennet's impertinence. She smiled and acquiesced to everything, and was entreated to visit Longbourn with her family the following day. Mrs. Bennet was vastly pleased with such a promising new acquaintance, and after exclaiming her triumph to the housekeeper, Mrs. Hill, she burst into her husband's book-room as soon as she returned home. "Such elegant manners!" she cried, amidst a rhapsody of praise for her tractable new friend. "So affable, so obliging. I dare say we will find her sons to be quite the same with such a mother. My dear Mr. Bennet, can you think of anything better for our girls?" Mr. Bennet at once agreed that it was a fine thing for all his daughters that Lady Bertram should prove an agreeable neighbour. Mrs. Bennet had, in 24 years, never ceased to be astonished by her husband's teasing. "Mr. Bennet, how can you be so tiresome? I speak of her sons, of course," she huffed. "I have a notion of their marrying our girls." "You have made quick work of it, my dear," Mr. Bennet drawled. "Pray, which of our daughters am I to congratulate?" "Really, Mr. Bennet, you have no sense of how these things work. What I mean is that Tom and Edmund Bertram may very likely form an attachment with one of our daughters." Mr. Bennet raised both eyebrows. "I hope for everyone's sake it may be 2 of our daughters to be so fortunate." Yes, yes," Mrs. Bennet bristled with impatience. "I have it all planned out, and I am sure Lady Bertram will be a most agreeable ally. She is bringing her sons to meet the girls to-morrow."
Am I to understand, madam, that you have begun planning to unite one or more of our daughters with gentlemen whose acquaintance you have yet to make? What can you mean by it?"
"I mean to see our girls well settled, Mr. Bennet, while you mean only to vex me. Tom Bertram is the heir to a baronetcy, and Edmund Bertram is to take orders and make a very fine clergyman. Their mother has assured me they are both handsome and amiable, so all that remains is to introduce them to our dear girls. I think the eldest will prefer Jayne, for she is too beautiful to marry anyone who is not set to inherit a house and title. But then it would be a fine thing to have Lydia settled so near, and Lizzie might do for a man of the church, if she can hold her tongue, or perhaps Kitty. I am sure I shall wish the Mr. Bertrams well with whichever of our girls they may fall in love with."
"I see," Mr. Bennet replied, reaching for the book that his wife's intrusion had obliged him to set aside. "And all this you mean to accomplish on the morrow?"
"Yes, exactly," Mrs. Bennet replied. "I mean to take the girls into the village directly, and purchase some new ribbons, only we shall require the carriage again, for I cannot chance them over-tiring themselves walking, and of course they will need new gowns for the assembly next week. And I should like some lace for myself, for I—"
Mr. Bennet held up a hand to stop her. "No lace, Mrs. Bennet, I beg you. Off with you now, save such chatter for the shopkeepers, as there is profit to be had for them in hearing it." Mrs. Bennet waited expectantly as Mr. Bennet pretended to return his attention to his book. She fidgeted with her fichu, and then began to examine the tassels on her reticule, as if to find fault with them, when Mr. Bennet obliged her at last by handing over a generous sum. She thanked her husband, and promised him they should be sharing a very spoilt grandchild with Lady Bertram and Sir Thomas within a 12-month. As she bustled from the room, Mr. Bennet allowed himself a little smile, and he called out to her over the top of his book, "Have a care, Fanny dear. Do not adorn yourself in the same finery as our daughters, else these Bertram fellows may like you best of all." As promised, Lady Bertram brought her sons to Longbourn the following day. Mrs. Bennet was ready with elated praise before they had troubled themselves to deserve it. The very sight of the gentlemen as they alighted from their carriage, and attentively assisted their lady mother, was enough for Mrs. Bennet to commence her raptures as she directed her daughters about the drawing-room. The comfortable feminine disarray that had ever marked mid-morning at Longbourn was hastily remedied. Every furnishing was tidied, and so was every lady within. Cheeks were pinched and lips were bitten to achieve rosy hues on 5 hopeful faces, while tables were decluttered, pillows fluffed, and every article of idle amusement cleared away by a beleaguered Mrs. Hill. The younger Bennet girls giggled and nudged one another, as their mother vacillated between narrating all that she beheld from the wide window, looking down on the front drive, and scolding and posing her daughters into poised perfection. Jayne and Elizabeth, seated together on a sofa that would easily admit a third between themselves, bore it all with serene amusement. They knew what their mother did not, else they might have shared her excitement at such a moment. The frantic atmosphere in the room at once gave way to a great display of warm female grace, as their guests were announced. Mrs. Hill, a consummate professional even in such a household, showed the Bertrams in just as her mistress had rehearsed, suggesting the visitors happened upon the Bennets in such a state of casual tranquillity as could always be discovered in Longbourn's drawing-room. Lady Bertram introduced her sons, and Mrs. Bennet presented her daughters in turn, and they were all very pleased with one another.
Seats were offered and taken, and then refreshments. Everything was civilly done. As with the beginning of any acquaintance, remarks on the weather gave way to comments on their neighbourhood, and every banal inquiry about their new friend's interests and diversions, as may be expected. Mr. Tom Bertram's easy manners and lively conversation might have rendered any topic interesting. He spoke chiefly of his horses and enthusiasm for racing. When further prompted by the younger girls, who hung upon every word of the fashionably attired gentleman, Mr. Bertram went on to profess a partiality for London and all its attractions, especially the theatre. Lydia and Kitty instantly agreed with all that he said. They were ready to like what he liked, and to admire him and to inspire his reciprocated admiration. Even Jayne and Elizabeth were not immune to his amiable magnetism. He spoke well, and divided his attention generously between them all. And he listened attentively when the elder sisters expressed their own fondness for London, for they had spent considerable time with their aunt and uncle in town. Like their cousin Mary Crawford, Jayne and Elizabeth felt an immediate preference for the younger brother, despite the charms of the elder. Edmund Bertram was only slightly less than his brother in address and appearance, but fortune favoured him with an audience already inclined in his favour. Knowing him to be the object of their cousin's affections, whether she would confess it or not, the two sisters thought only of warm friendship with Edmund Bertram, and seemed destined to be so. He expressed himself with intelligence, wit, and even passion when the right subjects were introduced. He was well read enough to please Elizabeth, had enough kind words for everyone to satisfy Jayne, and was ready enough to be content amongst their community as to ensure his welcome there. He was also fond of music, and so eloquent on the subject that Elizabeth privately resolved he must never be made to suffer her mediocre performance. Of dancing he was less enamoured. He admitted to being no better than adequate when called upon to do so, and called upon he was, for Mrs. Bennet responded with alacrity to the very mention of that pastime, which she felt would surely further her ambitions to turn two lucky Bennets into Bertrams. "I hope you intend to dance at the assembly next week," Mrs. Bennet said, waving her handkerchief in Edmund's direction. "It would be a great shame if you disappointed all the young ladies and offended half the neighbourhood. My girls are all excellent dancers, though it is such a pity they have not more opportunities for dancing, unless they stand up with one of their sisters, for there are always too many ladies and never enough gentlemen. Ah, what a fine thing you have come, and I dare say you shall see how graceful, my dear girl." Tom Bertram took the bait at once, saying all that was expected of him. "I would dance with all your daughters at once if I could, madam, but it would make quite the scandal. I shall eagerly anticipate the chance to do so on Tuesday next, to dance with them, that is," he cried with a roguish wink. "Perhaps the eldest Miss Bennet would care to promise me her fair hand for the opening set, and Miss Lydia, who has been kind enough to laugh at all my jests, even the very poor ones. I cannot imagine a more gratifying companion for the supper set. Miss Elizabeth, Miss Kitty, I mean not to slight you. If you will honour me in order of birth, 'tis neatly done of me, is it not, madam?" Mrs. Bennet agreed it was tremendously kind and clever of him to arrange it thus, and after instructing her girls to thank the gentleman, she turned her gaze to his brother. It was now Edmund's turn to satisfy his hostess, and he did so with all sincerity, though less of the showmanship of his brother. He elected to open the dance with Elizabeth, and secured Jayne for the supper set. "If I, too, dance with you all in descending order, I shall be first with nearly all of you," he said, proud of his own repartee. Only Miss Bennet will partner with me the hope of finding me as animated as Tom, and I shall have the dinner to beg her forgiveness for my dismal performance." Jane said something kind, while Elizabeth said something clever, and Edmund acknowledged them each with more of the same. Seeming more at ease with them than their sisters, he devoted his attention to the 2 eldest Bennet sisters for the remainder of the visit. They were promptly singled out by their mother as soon as their guest had departed. "My dear girls, how well you have done! You are to be congratulated on your conquests, I am sure. How handsome, how very gentlemanly the Bertram brothers are! Everything cordial and agreeable. Mr. Tom Bertram is so very handsome, Jane, and you so very beautiful. What a fine couple you shall make! Dancing the first! Everyone shall see. Nobody could doubt you to be perfectly suited for one another. His easy charm and your gentle diffidence. Perfectly matched. What fine clothes you shall have! And to be settled so near as Purvis Lodge! I shall go distracted at such felicity." While Hill lingered at the periphery of the room, smelling salts at the ready, Elizabeth stepped forward to tease her mother. "Mamma, he has asked her merely for a dance, not for her hand in marriage." "Not yet, but I have no doubt it will not be long," Mrs. Bennet insisted. "He was looking quite smitten already, and why should he not be? Is your sister not the loveliest creature in all the world? She is sure to be the prettiest face he sees in Hertfordshire, and such a dear, sweet girl. And do not look so satirical, Lizzie. I could see that you like Edmund Bertram well enough that he shall dance the first with you, though he claims to dislike the amusement. You have an admirer for all your talk of books, and your bantering circles around the rest of us. Well, if you can catch him with your cleverness, so much the better." Elizabeth informed her mother that she had no intention of catching Mr. Bertram, nor was her delight in reading designed to arouse an opinion of any kind in the opposite sex. But Mrs. Bennet would not hear her. She knew what was best for her daughters, and she trusted they only wanted the romantic thrill of dancing at the assembly with their respective Bertram mate, to see things as she did. She knew just how it would be, for already everything was going just exactly as she had planned. Jane and Elizabeth were of their own minds, though neither of them wished to exert themselves to spoil their mother's hopes. Their feeble protestations were abandoned. Mrs. Bennet commended their natural delicacy in denying their desire to wed the Bertrams by Michaelmas, but she did not at all believe their hopes were not aligned with her own. Privately, the 2 sisters admitted their reservations. They each agreed that the gentlemen would make pleasing neighbours, whose company might be valued at assemblies and the occasional card-party or large dinner. Beyond this, neither sister had any hopes or wishes. "If what Cousin Mary has informed us of their financial woes is true, I dare say neither gentleman will marry cheaply," Elizabeth observed. "I am sure none of us could ever expect to become Lady Bertram, not with Mr. Bertram's fondness for town. No doubt he has friends enough there to recommend himself to a young lady of fortune and family," Jane replied. "Even if Mary's report is true. But remember, dear sister, that we do not know all the particulars." "You are right," Elizabeth admitted, "but even knowing that he is disposed toward gambling is enough to give me pause, when done to such an excess as to oblige his father to rent out their family seat." "I could never think ill of a gentleman who had only Purvis Lodge. It is a fine house," Jane said, "though I shall seek nothing but friendship from him until I know his character better. It is possible he may have seen how his habits have harmed his family. Perhaps he wishes to start afresh here." "And what of Edmund Bertram? He has nearly all the charms of his elder brother, and apparently none of the vices," Elizabeth said. "I thought him perhaps just a little more amiable than his brother, and therefore more handsome," Jayne replied with a shy smile. "But he spoke to you for most of the visit, and stared at you for the rest of it. I had rather thought that to be due to my resemblance to our cousin. Our aunt and uncle have always said that she and I could be sisters, twins even." Elizabeth furrowed her brow, unsure of what to make of Edmund Bertram's attentions. "You resemble her in wit and vivacity as well as in loveliness," Jayne said with a sweet smile. "Of course, I am inclined to think you just a little superior in every way, and I should not be surprised if he were to agree. After all, you do not share Mary's aversion to the clergy. He could not know that, though I suppose it is a fair assumption to make." Elizabeth mused aloud. "At any rate, my knowing that Mary cherishes such a tonder shall surely prevent me from ever doing so myself. She would not confess it directly, but I suspect she is still very attached to him. Poor Mr. Bertram! I am sure Mary will never make any concession. I should be sorry indeed to see him disappointed." Elizabeth shook her head and gave her sister a wry smile. "He must be the best judge of his own happiness. If he returns our cousin's affections, they must sort it out between themselves. If he does not, I shall never be the cause of her unhappiness." "Nor would I," Jayne agreed with a rosy blush tinting her cheeks. "How dreadful it would be if she were to hear of Mamma's plans for us." "I dare say Mary has plans of her own, Jayne. You know how sly she can be." Elizabeth laughed. "Indeed, if she has not contrived an excuse to visit us within a fortnight, I shall be very much surprised." Chapter 3. "Another letter from our charming cousins. We shall see them ere long. Surely they can wait." Henry teased his sister as he pushed open the door to her bedchamber and leaned jauntily in the door-frame. "Odious rascal, sneaking up on me like that!" Mary chided him. "I might have been undressed, and then you should be sorry. No, indeed. Your door was left ajar, and, at any rate, I know my sister to be a paragon of perfection who is always in an absolute state of readiness for anything." Mary raised her brows, her countenance a challenge. "I have heard from Lady Bertram." Henry could not conceal his flustered reaction from her. "Lady Bertram? You and I did not exactly part with her children on the best of terms, which is why I could not allow them to think we have pursued them across the country. Do we not go to see our cousins?" "I have not told them we are coming," she said with a smirk. Henry snorted with laughter. "That is rather high-handed of you, Mary." Mary shook her head at her brother. "It is a fortunate thing one of us is clever, else where should we be? You know it would not do to give Edmund and Maria the notion that we have gone into Hertfordshire for their sake. It should weaken my position with Edmund considerably, and Maria is already far too vain, and the ruse of visiting our cousins would be transparent, and therefore beneath me. It would never do." Henry looked on with amusement, ready to appreciate her brilliance, and Mary stood from her dressing-table. As her brother had predicted, she was immaculately put together and ready to present herself before her companions, but for now she paced about the room, enjoying the triumph of her genius. "No, I have come up with a better idea. I wrote to Lady Bertram, and I mentioned that we were staying with Mr. Bingley, a friend of many years." "To make Edmund jealous?" Henry looked dubious. Mary ignored him. "As an aside, I casually mentioned that while we are all perfectly content to be in town again at last, our dear Bingley is in search of a country estate. What a pity we did not know of his endeavours before we left Mansfield Park, else we might have recommended him for the place, though, of course, we hope that old friend of the Admiral's is enjoying the house and the fine parklands I have such fond memories of walking in. But if Lady Bertram should know of any similar situations, I should be exceedingly obliged, and pass the information on to Mr. Bingley. Indeed, if there were such a place in Hertfordshire, I am sure it would suit him, for my cousins in that country tell me the scenery thereabouts is some of the most picturesque in England. Hertfordshire, the most picturesque scenery in England? Henry screwed up his face at her. Well, of course it is not, but my little exaggeration has accomplished just what I desire. Lady Bertram has written back, and amongst her inanities she has mentioned Netherfield. Our Aunt Bennet has lamented to her that it should sit empty for so long. Aunt Bennet and Lady Bertram. Good Lord, what fascinating conversation they must have. Henry mused, with a twinkle of mischief in his eyes. You are determined to be wicked today? Mary drawled. I, scheming minx, I ought to be ashamed of having such a sister, Henry said with a devilish grin. What a burden it must be to have such a shocking relation, Mary agreed. Henry clapped his hands together with a saucy look. And while we are speaking of shocking relations, you will never guess who has joined our little party here. You wish to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it, Mary replied. I came to your room with no other purpose. Bingley's aunt has just decamped from Lord Mainwaring's country estate, and intends to impose herself on her favourite nephew. Bingley's aunt? Mary twisted her mouth with distaste at the idea of another Mrs. Norris, some aged, bothersome busybody, hovering over them to spoil their amusements with antiquated notions of propriety. She is the younger half-sister of his late lamented mother, the much younger half-sister. Wait, Mainwaring. I am sure I know that name, Mary mused. I have heard it whispered of, or seen it in the papers. Oh, surely you cannot mean. Henry grinned at her. Come down with me and see for yourself. Bingley has been obliged to receive the most accomplished flirt in all England. Downstairs, Lady Susan Vernon was already holding court in the drawing-room. She had all the appearance of a woman who must have been pretty at 16, and even prettier 10 years later. 20 years had been kinder still, for her radiant beauty was augmented by the poise of confidence and experience. The lady was seated in a most becoming pose between her niece and nephew, clasping hands with each of them as she spoke with 2 other gentlemen seated opposite. Mary stopped in the corridor, and Henry halted beside her. She made a subtle gesture in the turning of her head toward the man beside Mr. Darcy. She had seen him the day before, departing Mr. Bingley's house just as she had returned from calling on her friend Mrs. Fraser. Knowing Henry to have been within the house at the time, she expected him to relay something useful about the almost handsome stranger, clad all in black. That is Richard Fitzwilliam, the second son of the Earl of Matlock, and Darcy's favourite cousin, Henry said, keeping his voice low enough that they would not be heard. He is a recent widower. She was the heiress to an estate that he has not the fortune to fix up. I understand it was long mismanaged by his mother-in-law. I should think him easily purchased with a dowry like yours, if you take a fancy to him, though I suspect Darcy invited him to Netherfield with us for the sake of diverting Miss Bingley's other interests. Mary instantly supposed it best to allow Miss Bingley some distraction, if indeed she could be detached from her ambition to become the next mistress of Pemberley. That would suit Mary's purposes far better, for she had yet to decide whether Mr. Bingley or Mr. Darcy would please her best, and she suspected Miss Bingley might present an obstacle either way. A sad widower will do for a tradesman's daughter, who has seen a few seasons pass, Mary whispered. But he is too dreary to be handsome. That he is, Henry agreed. I understand his mother-in-law is something of a gorgon. He has fled to London, and allowed her to haunt the house he has inherited. Henry made a droll face, as if he might say more, but his attention had been captured by laughter at the end of the corridor. Lady Susan had said something to amuse the whole room. After taking a few steps toward the drawing-room, Henry snapped his head back to Mary, who had warily pursued him. I have heard Lady Susan possesses a sort of captivating deceit. It shall be most amusing to detect it, he said, all innocence. You worry me, dear brother, Mary gasped. They had drifted near enough the drawing-room by now that Lady Susan became aware of them, and looked in their direction with an amiable expression. What a pleasing fraternal pose, she said warmly. I hope I shall discover you to be the Crawfords of whom I have heard such praise. She extended a beckoning hand to them, and Henry was drawn in at once. This is Mr. Henry Crawford of Everingham in Norfolk, and his sister Miss Mary Crawford, Bingley said. Allow me to present my aunt, Lady Susan Vernon. Henry offered her a very gallant bow, his fascination instantly overshadowing Mary's presence at his side. Enchanted, he said. I have heard much of you. The lady appeared astonished at his statement. From my niece and nephew, do you mean? I am sure I cannot imagine there should be anything of note to be said of a widow such as myself. I have exchanged one happy situation of quiet country life for the prospect of another, as dear Charlie has been so kind as to invite me to travel with you all to Hertfordshire. Delightful, Henry replied. I cannot say what delights I could have any right to expect, she said, fluttering her lashes in a very demure affectation. I understand my other niece, Mrs. Hurst, is not well enough to travel at present, poor creature, and so in her stead I have offered my assistance as a chaperone and hostess for my nephew. Mary observed a fleeting look of jealous mortification on Miss Bingley's face. She seemed to feel Mary's gaze and looked that way. For a minute the two women shared a look that conveyed their mutual apprehension. But Miss Bingley did not allow their mutual understanding to linger. She turned away, chin up, and resumed her haughty indifference. Lady Susan was still commanding the attention of the rest of the party. How proud your parents would have been, she said to Mr. Bingley, though Henry remained her first object. I know my poor late sister would have been delighted to see Charlie managing an estate, even a rented one. In this respect, Mr. Crawford, you may imagine what pleasure I feel, but beyond this, of course, I am pleased that my nephew has such amiable friends, and I am grateful to have had such a warm and welcoming reception. But beyond this, I beg you not attribute any motives to me. Certainly the frivolities of youth can hold little appeal when contrasted with the wholesome coziness of an intimate family gathering. Mary was nearly moved to respect the cunning creature's talent for pretty falsehoods. She endured a great many of them throughout dinner, as Lady Susan lamented the antics of her intractable young daughter, the devastating loss of her much older husband, and the many cruelties and slights of his relations. For her own family she was heavy with syrupy praise, and spoke at length of her humble gratification at the prospect of such a happy and rustic reunion. It was no surprise to Mary that Mr. Bingley should be taken in by his relation, for he was of an open and artless disposition, and of course he had been accustomed, as the brother of such a sister, to hearing every manner of disingenuous mendacity. Neither was it a great shock that Henry seemed ready to revise his previous bias against the lady. It was all too predictable, albeit disappointing. Mary had cherished some particular hopes for her brother, as they made ready to visit Hertfordshire. These plans pertained especially to her eldest cousin, for Henry had always admired her, and gentle Jayne would undoubtedly suit him far better than the type of woman that usually attracted Henry's notice. It was disappointing, but not surprising to Mary that her brother should succumb so easily to Lady Susan's arts and allurements, especially after his interest in Maria Bertram at Mansfield Park. His game there had been transparent enough, and might have ended in disaster if they had not taken their leave when they did. Lady Susan's abilities were considerable. She was far more formidable than the former Miss Bertram, and like the new Mrs. Rushworth, Lady Susan might hold Henry in her thrall for as long as she chose it. In other words, until a safer choice could be made. Mary had no desire to face such a challenge. It would be complicated enough selecting the superior prospect between Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley, while residing in the vicinity of Edmund Bertram. Certainly she would not be tempted to yield her position regarding the latter, and his unpalatable choice of vocation. She wished no further encumbrance, as she assessed the gentlemen of her party, for Mr. Bingley's engaging manners were just what she liked, even if his wit was not as quick as her own, while the taciturn Mr. Darcy's fortune and connections could not be discounted solely because of his dour disposition, which might be improved by a lively and witty wife. Such was the turn of Mary's mind for the remainder of the evening. Lady Susan continued to discreetly direct her allure toward Henry, while maintaining the illusion of a virtuous widow. Mary was obliged to divert so great a share of her attention to preventing her brother from making a ninny of himself, that she was unable to exert her full powers of pleasing on her quarry. Knowing she could not carry on so feebly once she arrived in a county where she had so many pretty cousins, Mary resolved she must leave Henry to his own devices, and hope for the best. She might implore Jayne or Elizabeth to detach him from the notorious minx. For herself, she was most determined to induce Mr. Bingley to show her a degree of preference beyond the eager affability he bestowed upon all, and to somehow manage to tempt Mr. Darcy out of his perpetual state of stony silence. She would have him smiling, and Mr. Bingley fairly drooling, and Edmund Bertram would certainly repine his wretched decision to take orders. She retired that evening with the hard-won satisfaction of having privately convinced herself, through the acute observation of her companions, that she was quite capable of outmanoeuvring the combined efforts of every female to be found at Netherfield, Longbourn, and Purvis Lodge. Just for good measure, she reminded Henry to have her harp sent on to Netherfield in all haste. Chapter 4. Mrs. Bennet wasted no time in celebrating the good news. Netherfield Park was let at last. Mrs. Hill had faithfully passed along the servants' chatter as soon as she had heard it. It was known by now all over the village. A large party of gentlemen was to come amongst them. Mrs. Bennet was beside herself. She demanded Mr. Bennet call upon their new neighbours as soon as they arrived. He agreed only that he might write this Mr. Bingley, informing him that he and his friends were welcome to any and all of his daughters they may choose. Mrs. Bennet had worked herself into a state of hysteria, and was obliged to hastily comport herself when a visitor was announced. She called for her smelling salts, declared it must be Mr. Bingley come to pay the courtesy her husband would not, and scolded each of her daughters in rapid succession. "Make haste, girls," she cried. "Jane, take off that apron. Lizzie, put away that book. Hang that cough of yours, Kitty. Oh, for heaven's sake, Lydia, you may have the bonnet if only you will tidy those ribbons. Oh, I shall go distracted, I swear I shall." Mrs. Bennet did, in fact, regain possession of herself soon after her vow that she would not. All sense of urgency dissolved in the drawing-room, when Mrs. Hill managed at last to make the identity of their caller known to Mrs. Bennet. It was only Lady Bertram. That which might have delighted Mrs. Bennet a week ago now only vexed her. But this feeling, too, was fleeting. Her new friend had come with news. "Well, Mrs. Bennet, I suppose you have heard all about Netherfield?" Lady Bertram said once everyone was calmly taking tea together. "My maid told me it was all over the servants' hall. It must be the same here." Mrs. Bennet feigned disinterest, and played with her bracelets, hoping her friend might have more to say than she had heard already. She sighed. "It has often been rumoured that some gentleman or other means to settle there. I never credit such talk." "Well, perhaps I can persuade you," Lady Bertram replied, petting the pug in her lap so idly that she could hardly be imagined capable of exerting anything like real influence. "I believe I am acquainted with some of their party." Now Mrs. Bennet's interest was captivated. Her veneer of nonchalance quickly vanished. Jane and Elizabeth listened with considerable interest, and perhaps some little suspicion, though they were not kept in suspense for long. "A friend of the family, Miss Crawford, wrote to me recently," Lady Bertram said with languid satisfaction. "She and her brother were visiting relations at the parsonage, while Sir Thomas was lately in London, and I dare say we did not go a day without seeing them. Such charming young people. I understand they went to London when they left Mansfield, and their particular friend, Mr. Bingley, mentioned that he wished to take a house in the country. Miss Crawford heard from her cousins in Hertfordshire that it is such a fine country. She asked if we might know of a suitable place, and you had only just spoken to me of Netherfield." Mrs. Bennet was happy to share the credit of these new neighbours with her friend, though the name Crawford gave her pause. "What Crawfords? Cousins in Hertfordshire, you say?" Elizabeth was swift to speak before her mother said something severe. "I am sure we are those very cousins in Hertfordshire. It is certainly Mary and Henry that you speak of, for she wrote to me several times while she was staying with the Grants." Jane added a few kind words, expressing how highly their cousins had spoken of the Bertrams. Mrs. Bennet grumbled her dislike of her youngest sister's children. Lydia and Kitty giggled, and Lady Bertram remained placid, scarcely reacting to any of them. The visit did not last much longer than this. Lady Bertram knew nothing of Mr. Bingley's party beyond that it was reported to be a large one. It was not until the following day that Mrs. Bennet gleaned their numbers. 4 gentlemen and 4 ladies, all single. The Bertram brothers, and her designs upon them for her daughters, were all forgotten now. 4 gentlemen for my 4 girls! Is it not Providence? A shame they must bring 4 ladies, but then I dare say they are nothing to my dear girls." Despite reassuring herself that her daughters were the prettiest creatures in the county, And hearing the same reassurance repeated back to her by her husband, Mrs. Bennet could not long forego her lamentations. "Such a large party they are, and they shall scarcely need our company for amusement. And I am sure those wretched Crawfords shall be about every imaginable mischief against us all, just like their mother, both of them. Scheming and artful creatures. I cannot understand why you should wish to write to her, Lizzie, nor what that wretched girl thinks to gain in pretending to care a fig about you." "Mamma," Jane said gently, "you know we have been fond of them since childhood." "Yes, but they have grown artful and vain, just like my dreadful sister Harriet. They thought themselves too grand for Cheapside, and went to live with that horrid admiral who was twice the villain their father was." "Our aunt and uncle in Gracechurch Street had too many children of their own by then," Elizabeth reminded her mother. "You credit them with too much generosity. I am sure they think only of themselves," Mrs. Bennet insisted. "No doubt they have already formed designs on the Bertrams. Your cousin Mary wishes to catch a title, and has pursued the Bertrams here, where they ought to distinguish the local girls with that sort of special attention. Well, you have always been far prettier than Mary Crawford, my dear Jane. Tom Bertram has already singled you out, and you need not fear, Lizzie. Surely your cousin would never look twice at a clergyman. Edmund Bertram will make you a very fine match." "Mamma," Elizabeth protested. She stopped herself from mentioning Mary's prior claim on Edmund Bertram's affection, but could think of no other objection. Mrs. Bennet was happy to supply one herself. "Perhaps you are a little too headstrong for a clergyman. You would try the patience of a saint, how well I know it. But one of these gentlemen at Netherfield may prefer an obstinate wife, and once I have you off my hands, they cannot give you back again," she said, mimicking her husband's sardonic style of expression. Mr. Bennet nodded his agreement, giving a wink to the daughter in question. Elizabeth was happy to jest with her mother rather than argue about her cousins. It must be a safe supposition that one man of the four would be so impolitic. But you know I could never love a man who was out of his wits, mamma. "I could never love a man who was not handsome," Lydia said with a flourish, "and of course he must be fond of dancing." "He must be a wonderful dancer," Kitty cried, "and fond of a good joke too, for I dearly love to laugh."
"An estimable family trait."
"I should ask only that he is affable and kind," Jane said meekly. "And fabulously wealthy," Elizabeth added with a mirthful glance at her mother. "Naturally," Mrs. Bennet agreed. "I am sure your cousin Mary would not have attached herself to them if they were not all these things, and highly eligible besides. How irksome that we must rely on her for an introduction! But then you shall dance with all of them at the assembly." This was merely conjecture, but Mrs. Bennet was confident that she could will their arrival to take place before the assembly. She could not countenance being thrown into the hedgerows whenever her dear husband saw fit to depart this world for the next one, and so she meant to wish her hopes into a reality. She would have 4 daughters wed, or at the very least engaged, by Michaelmas, and the assembly was the start of all her plans. Chapter 5. Mrs. Bennet's triumph was not lessened by being only mostly correct. 7 of the 8 new residents of Netherfield were in attendance at the assembly. Mary Crawford performed the introductions, gratifying Mrs. Bennet by coming to her before approaching the Bertrams. This, Elizabeth supposed, spoke more of Mary's reluctance to her own partiality for Edmund Bertram than any family allegiance, but it was enough that Mrs. Bennet was mollified. Elizabeth had come to the assembly with greater hopes for amusement in observation than dancing. Thus she had not long to wait to be amply rewarded. Mrs. Bennet was struck silent by the approach of the large and elegant contingent of newcomers, though the movements of her widened eyes and the turn of her countenance bespoke rapid calculation. No doubt she was already revising her matrimonial plans for her daughters at the very sight of such fine gentlemen. Despite her mother's machinations, Elizabeth was as pleased as her mother and sisters at making the acquaintance of their new neighbours. Mr. Bingley greeted them warmly, and expressed himself well in speaking of his satisfaction with Netherfield and its environs. He was an amiable man, ready to please and be pleased, and seemed to be already on such familiar terms with Mary and Henry that Elizabeth had every expectation of liking him. His sister made a much different impression. The fair-complected young woman seemed to be of an age with Jayne and Mary, and though not as pretty as either of them, she was more stylish than both, in keeping with her fashionable person. Her comportment was much the same. She was not incorrect in her manners, but neither was there much in them that Elizabeth could like. A glance at her favourite cousin seemed to signal some agreement from Mary, and a smirk from Elizabeth was a promise to speak of it later. Another of Mr. Bingley's relations was the subject of considerable interest to Elizabeth, and doubly so to her mother. Lady Susan Vernon claimed a rather tenuous connection with the young people she addressed as niece and nephew, though her pretty expressions of affection appeared to satisfy them enough. Mrs. Bennet was instantly struck with delight to discover that one lady of the party, at least, should be no threat to her daughter's prior claim upon every gentleman in the county. Lady Susan was no less elated to make the acquaintance of the Bennets. She exclaimed over each daughter in turn, was enchanted by the loveliness of all four, and remarked upon the uncanny resemblance between Mary and Elizabeth. She spoke a few words of criticism concealed as praise for her own daughter Frederica, who was away at school, and offered Mrs. Bennet a few prettily phrased observations on the trials of motherhood. Mrs. Bennet was easily charmed by Lady Susan's maternal disseminations. She declared they were very near the same age, for Mrs. Bennet had, of her own free will, remained 35 for several years. Mr. Bingley asked each of the Bennet girls for a dance, as was right and proper. Mrs. Bennet was certain that her girls would captivate all the gentlemen in turn, and so she carried her new friend away to introduce her to Lady Bertram. But not all of Mr. Bingley's companions were of a mind to gratify Mrs. Bennet's wishes. Henry was rather more eager to recommend himself than his aunt would have liked, and the other two gentlemen were quite the reverse. In what Elizabeth thought a terrible tragedy, the handsomest gentleman of the party proved also to be the least agreeable. Mr. Darcy was tall and broad-shouldered, and quite possibly the finest-looking man Elizabeth had ever seen, and also the most aggressively silent. He appeared to observe everything that was passing with alacrity, but his attitude was stern and sullen. He spoke not a word to the Bennet sisters, and appeared chiefly occupied in his attempt to conceal a considerable degree of disdain. Mr. Fitzwilliam was not quite as taciturn, though his manners were subdued. He responded with more than an incline of his head when spoken to, but he had none of his friend Mr. Bingley's enthusiasm for Netherfield, nor his willingness to stand up with every lady he could. Mr. Fitzwilliam asked only for Miss Bingley's opening set, a mark of respect that Mr. Darcy did not seem to think was due his hostess. Neither of them condescended to ask the Bennet sisters for a set, and Elizabeth quickly surmised it would be a punishment to stand up with them if they did ask her. Mary and Henry gave their cousins the liveliest greetings of all, for a genuine and tender affection had existed between the two pairs of siblings for many years. Mary, a faithful correspondent, asked after their recent activities, while Henry exclaimed over how they had improved since last he saw them. "But you are a woman grown," cried he. "How well you look! Jane, you are a little taller, I think, and Lizzie, you are not at all. Ah, but your wicked looks have not altered." Elizabeth only laughed, but Jane's face grew rosy. "I was a woman when last we met, before you went to Cambridge." A knowing look passed between them, and another look was shared by Elizabeth and Mary. Henry had written Jane some exceedingly sentimental poetry when she was 16, and some years later Mary had finally succeeded in prevailing upon Jane to share it with herself and Elizabeth. Since then, Mary and Elizabeth had cherished a secret hope for Jane and Henry that would have had Mrs. Bennet calling for her smelling salts, had she known of it. "I am sure your ruby lips are looking very full," Mary said to Jane, earning Henry's instant attention. "And how your golden hair shines like the sun." To Henry's relief, his humiliation was interrupted when the Bertram brothers came to claim Jane and Elizabeth. The dancing had begun. Mary greeted both Tom and Edmund Bertram with equal civility, and with the latter the unspoken tension was perceptible only because they all rather expected it to be thus. Elizabeth danced with each of the Bertrams. The elder spoke of horse racing for the entire set, and the younger talked of naught but her resemblance to Mary. After such a beginning, Mr. Bingley made a very superior partner. His conversation was agreeable and amusing. When he had run out of praise for his new house and his new acquaintance, he asked after Elizabeth and her relations, and listened with eager interest. The dance itself was an invigorating one. Elizabeth declared it to be her favourite, and Mr. Bingley hastily agreed. "It puts me in mind to give a ball at Netherfield," he fairly shouted, when the movements of the boisterous dance permitted him to address her. "Shall your companions approve?" Elizabeth asked, hazarding a little impudence. "I understand one of your friends chose not to attend our gathering, and 2 or 3 others do not seem inclined to dance." It was true. Mr. Fitzwilliam had stood up with Miss Bingley with a look of duty about him, and then retired to the corner to skulk about with Mr. Darcy. By now, the rumours of Mr. Darcy's wealth, 10,000 a year, had circulated the ballroom, and yet his uncivil manners had already offended every mother and daughter in Meryton. It was excessively diverting. Elizabeth and Mr. Bingley spoke of other things when the dance allowed it, and smiled at one another the rest of the time. At the end of the set, he led her to the refreshment table, and returned to the subject of his companions. "Darcy and Richard, Mr. Fitzwilliam, are cousins. They share guardianship of Miss Darcy, who is 16, your sister Lydia's age, and not yet out in society. She remained at Netherfield this evening with her companion, Mrs. Annesley." "I wonder her guardians did not elect to remain with her," Elizabeth observed. "They did intend to," Mr. Bingley said, unperturbed by her impertinence, "but I have teased them into society by my usual method of ignoring their ill humour entirely." Elizabeth laughed. "Are you often obliged to force your friends to exert themselves?" Mr. Bingley's demeanour changed somewhat. He was not fully serious, but less ebullient, as he replied to Elizabeth, "Mr. Fitzwilliam is just out of mourning for his late wife, and Darcy wishes him to return to society. He always was a jovial fellow, full of japes and jests. but I understand he loved his wife very much, though she was always rather sickly. It is rather a romantic tale." Mr. Bingley stopped abruptly, looking as though he had said too much, but then he sipped at his punch and continued. "My sister also offered to remain at home with Miss Darcy, but I thought it better for her to meet our neighbours. I was quite looking forward to it, and I must say the evening has far exceeded my hopes and wishes." Elizabeth felt the warmth of a blush creep across her face. She could also feel her mother's gaze on her and Mr. Bingley from across the room. Elizabeth might have been inclined to flirt with Mr. Bingley, but she was too stubborn to gratify her mother's wishes, and her curiosity was by no means limited to the man before her. "Mr. Darcy seems disinclined to dance, or to become better acquainted with anybody," she said. "Perhaps it is no sacrifice for his sister to remain at home, if she shares his disposition. They are both of a reserved nature, it is true, rather awkward at times, but I am sure she would rather have attended," Mr. Bingley replied. "She is a timid girl, shy like Darcy, I think, but she is eager for company. I am sure you shall like her. In fact, may we call on you tomorrow? I know Darcy wishes her to be more in company before her coming out this winter, and your cousin, Miss Crawford, has already told Miss Darcy all about you and your sisters." Elizabeth's gaze drifted across the ballroom. Her two younger sisters were fawning over Tom Bertram, their indecorous laughter suggesting they had already consumed more punch than they ought to have been permitted. Beyond their indelicate display, Mrs. Bennet was speaking with Lady Susan. She gestured with great animation, and though she was more than 20 paces away, she was still audible over the general noise of the revelry around them. "He seems a most energetic young man. How well he looked standing up with my Lizzie. What a fine couple! But my Jayne is a splendid dancer. Is she not the most beautiful creature? Her cousin Henry Crawford is a rascal like his father was, not to be trusted, and his sister Mary is out for all she can get, just like her mother, my late sister. La! She is nothing to my own dear girls." Elizabeth's face fairly burned as her mother's voice seemed to echo across the assembly rooms. She looked away, and her eyes landed on the stoic Mr. Darcy. He was too far away, she hoped, to have heard her mother, yet he still seemed to be generally dissatisfied with the festivities around him. Such a man hardly seemed likely to rejoice in such inferior connections for his sister. When Elizabeth looked back at Mr. Bingley, he took pains to appear not to have heard her mother, but none-the-less he lifted her hand up, as if he would kiss it, and gave her a little bow. "I assure you, we should look forward to visiting you all at Longbourn," he said, reminding her of his unanswered question. "Yes, of course," Elizabeth said, recovering herself. "You shall be very welcome. That is, any of our new neighbours, including my excellent cousins, shall always be received with pleasure at Longbourn, sir. You may imagine my mother's delight at so many new acquaintance." This last was said with a droll tone and an arch look at Mr. Bingley. "Tomorrow, then," he said with a bright smile. "My aunt appears quite taken with your mother already. I have every hope we shall be very often together." Elizabeth indulged in the very pleasing effect his words had upon her, when said with such an ardent look. She had but a minute more to relish his flattery before he began to bestow it elsewhere. Henry joined them with Jayne on one arm and Mary on the other, and Mr. Bingley exclaimed his delight at their company with all the same warmth. "Miss Bennet, I do hope you have remembered our engagement. You danced very well with your cousin. Is not Henry a charming fellow? I should be loath to follow such a fine performance, but I intend to do my best." Laughing and smiling, Mr. Bingley led Jane to the dance with all the same sincere charm and enchantment he had shown Elizabeth, who burst out laughing as soon as the pair were away. Henry looked askance at her. "Lizzie, your Mr. Bingley is a most amusing young man," she said, still chagrined at her own presumption. She shook her head and said to Mary, "Every now and then I catch myself doing exactly as mamma would wish." Mary made a face of distaste and held up her hand. "No more talk of your mother, I beg you. But I should dearly wish to hear more of your opinion of a certain Mr. B." Henry leaned closer to them. He was generally considered a short man. He loosened his knees and crouched just a little to rest his head on his sister's shoulder, as he affected a feminine pose, and raised the pitch of his voice. "Pray tell us, dearest Lizzie, at whom have you set your cap?" Mary playfully shoved her brother away. "Awful beast," she said with a pretty laugh. "Go away. Off with you. We have private matters to discuss between ourselves." Henry stuck his tongue out at them and turned to go, but Mary caught him by the arm. "You must dance with one of our cousins," she commanded him. "I have stood up with Kitty and Lydia already," he protested. "Jane is dancing with Mr. Bingley, which has made Lizzie wild with envy, and I have engaged our dear girl here for the supper set, which has filled her with dread. I shall leave you to console her. I see her mamma is not yet dancing." Elizabeth attempted to look unbothered by his antics, but a smile tugged at her lips. Mary looked much the same, though she betrayed a little sigh of exasperation as Henry approached Mrs. Bennet and Lady Susan. "Come, Lizzie," Mary said, linking her arm through Elizabeth's. "We have no partners. Let us take a turn about the room. Our figures appear to best advantage when walking, and we have secret matters to discuss." Elizabeth acceded, and the two cousins began a slow circuit of the assembly-room. "Your Mr. Bertram is an amiable neighbour," Elizabeth observed, watching her cousin carefully. "His company is agreeable, though it has not inspired the same fanciful enthusiasm in my mother as his elder brother has, and so you are quite safe, Mary." Something in Mary's eyes betrayed her for a moment, but she schooled her countenance as she addressed Elizabeth. "You mistake me. I meant only to ask how you enjoyed your set with Mr. Bingley. I danced the first with him, and thought him a charming partner. He is an old friend of Henry's, though I have only just made his acquaintance. I am still making my mind up about him, and I know you to be an excellent judge of character." Elizabeth arched an eyebrow. "Do you doubt yourself?" "Never," Mary drawled with a smirk. After a moment she looked over at Elizabeth in all sincerity. "I confess I liked Mr. Bingley at once. He is everything a young man ought to be, sensible, good-humoured, lively, and handsome," Elizabeth interjected, watching as her cousin blushed, "which a young man ought to be if he possibly can. You know of my preference for such open and engaging manners. His breeding is perhaps not ideal, but I could more easily look past that then." This time Mary bit back the rest of her speech, and looked away for a moment. "Then the intent to take orders?" Elizabeth suggested, a silent challenge on her countenance. "Edmund has not asked me to dance," she said softly, fidgeting with her gloves. She finally looked back at Elizabeth and said a little louder, "Well, Mr. Bingley was very kind in asking me to dance the first, and the supper set as well. But I cannot decide if it is a compliment or a convenience, since you and Jane were already engaged for both sets." "Jane and I have known Mr. Bingley for an hour, Mary, and we do not share our mother's belief that he is already the rightful property of one of us or the other. You need not be coy.
If you like him, say so, and I shall wish you every joy." "Wish me joy?" Mary chortled and shook her head. "Perhaps you do favour your mother at times, for your imagination is very rapid. It jumps from admiration to love, and from love to matrimony in a moment. Wish me joy? Pah!" Elizabeth shared a look of mirth with Mary. "I shall wish you well, then, since you have admitted you admire him. You have liked many a stupider person, you know." "Certainly not." Mary laughed in spite of herself. "In truth, I shall always be well disposed toward anybody who likes me first." "You do like to be first," Elizabeth chided her cousin. "I know your ways. I think you wish to be first in every man's estimation. And yet Mr. Bingley is perfectly amiable to everybody. Rather equally so," Mary said. "It is terribly vexing. And Edmund Bertram, did he worship you above every other female?" "There were only his sisters and cousin for comparison. This is my first encounter with him among so much society, and we have scarcely spoken. As to what he may choose to worship, for what it is worth, he had promised to dance with all of us before he knew you would be in the area, and only after his brother had done the same," Elizabeth said, giving her cousin's arm a reassuring squeeze. "Perhaps he shall seek you out after supper." "It is of no importance to me, Lizzie. I bear him no ill will, beyond, I suppose, in wishing him a future bride, who is not quite as near perfection as I. But, truly, I have ceased to think of him in any particular way. His choice of profession remains a point of perpetual disagreement between us, and I am too stubborn to be moved on the matter." "Then I must once again wish you success with Mr. Bingley," Elizabeth replied, "and with his sister as well." Mary screwed up her face. "Oh, Lizzie, I felt instinctively that you and I were of one mind on that score. She thinks rather too well of herself, does she not? Indeed, and am sure she thinks well only of herself, and perhaps Mr. Darcy. I shall admit it was amusing at first, but imagine having such a sister-in-law." "And now whose imagination is grown too rapid?" Elizabeth grinned brightly. "Tease me all you like, but it is a serious consideration," Mary said, holding her shoulders in a confident pose. "We ladies do not often get to make choices and decisions of much import. But there is one matter in particular that I intend to examine from every angle. I shall take no risks with my own future happiness." Elizabeth was inclined to agree with her cousin, though she had not the opportunity to say so. Caroline Bingley moved past them, obliging the two cousins to fall guiltily silent. Miss Bingley was making haste to attach herself to Mr. Darcy, who had continued brooding silently in the corner with Mr. Fitzwilliam. Mary exchanged a devious look with Elizabeth, and then began to deliberately slow her steps until they had come to a stop just beyond the unsociable trio. The two mischievous cousins fanned themselves, smiling broadly at the general spectacle of the dancing before them, but their true focus was a few paces to their left. "I believe I can guess the subject of your reverie," Miss Bingley purred.
"I should imagine not," Mr. Darcy replied.
"You are considering how insupportable it would be to pass many evenings in this manner, among such company. I am quite of the same opinion."
Mr. Fitzwilliam's chest rumbled with subdued laughter. "I am sorry our dance together was not satisfactory, Miss Bingley."
"That is not at all what I mean, sir. I am sure the only desirable companions in the county must be found at Netherfield. But this place, the country manners, the vulgarity, The set was such a crush that I am sure the performance was not a credit to either of us, Mr. Fitzwilliam, though I do generally enjoy the amusement. I know you to be an excellent dancer, Mr. Darcy, though you have not chosen to participate in the revelry yet." Miss Bingley's posture stiffened, and her chest moved forward and up a little as she waited for Mr. Darcy to ask her to dance. "Do not think to demur on my account," Mr. Fitzwilliam said. "You have lured me out into the world, but you need not hover over me every moment, Darcy. You had much better dance." "At such an assembly as this, it would be insupportable," Mr. Darcy said gravely. "You have just declared that you did not enjoy it on this occasion, Miss Bingley, and there is nobody else present whom it would not be a punishment to stand up with." Mr. Fitzwilliam made an incredulous sound. "The Bennet sisters are reputed to be local beauties, are they not? I think them all perfectly lovely." "Your brother is dancing with the eldest of them, I believe," Mr. Fitzwilliam observed. "But I know you have never favoured fair complexions, Darcy. There is one of the other sisters just over there, the young lady who strongly resembles Miss Crawford. I dare say she is in want of a partner." Elizabeth fixed her gaze straight ahead, but she could feel 3 sets of eyes alight on her. Mary nudged her, but Elizabeth held very still, listening intently. "She is tolerable," Mr. Darcy said, "but not handsome enough to tempt me. I am in no humour to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men." Miss Bingley tittered maliciously. Mr. Fitzwilliam made some reply, but Elizabeth did not hear it. She laughed, and turned to share the amusement with her cousin. "We are duly chastened for our eavesdropping, though really it is Miss Bingley who is to be pitied. She actually likes Mr. Darcy." Mary smiled, but the mirth did not reach her eyes. "Yes, poor Miss Bingley, to be the only lady present held in high esteem by the richest man in the room." "He is also the rudest man in the room," Elizabeth countered. "The very rich can afford to give offence wherever they like, I suppose," Mary said coolly. "I need not care for his good opinion." Elizabeth laughed again, but regarded her friend quixotically. "Nor I, for I am the one he has deemed barely tolerable." "But you do not desire his good opinion," Mary replied. "And you know that of all my cousins you resemble me the most. You and Kitty, and Henry and I all favour our mothers, small and dark with a great deal of hair, while Jayne and Lydia are tall and fair like your father. Lady Susan remarked on our resemblance, and Mr. Fitzwilliam just now. And so you see Mr. Darcy must think I am also barely tolerable." "You and I and every lady in the room besides Miss Bingley," Elizabeth reminded her. "But why should you desire his admiration? I thought it was Mr. Bingley who—" "Mr. Bingley is an option, yes," Mary agreed, keeping her voice low. "But I told you I meant to consider every angle. Mr. Darcy's situation in life, well, a woman of my disposition would be willing to put up with a lot, to become mistress of the grandest estate in Derbyshire." "I dare say any woman shall have to," Elizabeth drawled, "though I could more easily forgive his vanity, had he not wounded mine. But no matter. You are such a large party at Netherfield that I doubt I shall ever have occasion to speak to Mr. Darcy, which is just what I should like, and I advise you to think no more of his insult, which signifies greater defects in him than either of us." "You are right," Mary admitted. "I ought not let it vex me. Perhaps in time he may find me more tolerable than you." "And even if he does not," Elizabeth quipped, "you shall have quite enough to agonize over in choosing between Mr. Bingley and Mr. Edmund Bertram." The agony, I assure you, shall be entirely theirs," Mary declared in such a way as to signal that she wished to jest her way out of the uncomfortable turn of conversation. Elizabeth thought the matter dropped. She cared little for Mr. Darcy's opinion, for he could amuse her very well indeed without troubling himself to think of her at all. His character was fixed in her mind as proud and disagreeable, but he was very likely to continue entertaining her without being much aware of it himself. She could not wait for her father to behold such a paragon of conceit, for he enjoyed such folly as much as she. Mary, however, was not content to let the matter rest. She danced the supper set with Mr. Bingley, while Elizabeth partnered Henry, and the four of them all sat down to dine together. Mary could not resist herself, and certain of having Mr. Bingley's attention, she addressed her brother. "I hope you have not over-imbibed, Henry, for you may be obliged to awaken very early tomorrow. I know you have always liked to style yourself the sort of romantic hero who would fight a duel to defend a woman's honour, and mine has been thoroughly misaligned, and Lizzie's too." Henry responded to her teasing tone with more of the same. "Pistols at dawn it is, then. Miss Crawford, what has happened?" Mr. Bingley looked plaintively between Mary and Elizabeth, and Mary described the offence with rather less embellishment than Elizabeth had expected. Henry gasped and scoffed and gave every other indication of being deeply aghast. Mary swatted at his exaggeration, which made the matter seem small indeed. Mr. Bingley, however, was clearly agitated. Elizabeth attempted to reassure him. "Truly, sir, it is not worth vexing yourself over such a trifle. I do not mean to do so. You have told me Mr. Darcy is shy and reserved, and so I can excuse his being unwilling to dance with strangers. You said he was in ill humour, and I am perfectly willing to suppose his worry for his cousin and sister must render him thus." Mr. Bingley looked prodigiously relieved. "Yes, exactly so. He is out of sorts tonight, though he ought not to have said such a thing. I am sure he had no notion of his comment being overheard, and Caroline does have an uncanny way of getting generally nice people to say unkind things, which I have often had to speak to her about." Elizabeth and Mary once again shared a secret look between them. Miss Bingley's sour hauteur promised to be an unceasing source of private amusement for them. Mr. Bingley, however, was determined to delight them in the usual style, with happy manners and warm praise. He apologized for his friend, and assured both the ladies that he had never seen such pretty ladies or pleasant company in all his life, and that if Mr. Darcy gave them any further offence, he should be the one to call his friend out himself. "That is hardly necessary," Elizabeth said gaily. "Mary and I may be the injured party, but I must hazard a guess that we are still enjoying the assembly substantially more. From the look of your friend, his own determination to be displeased has caused him to suffer enough." They all glanced in Mr. Darcy's direction. He sat predictably dull and silent with his cousin across the room. As if feeling their gaze, he looked up and stared back. Mary, Henry, and Mr. Bingley all looked away, but Elizabeth did not. Neither did Mr. Darcy. Their eyes burned into one another for a minute more, and Elizabeth gave the barest of smiles. He looked away first. Elizabeth felt his discomfort must be some justice, and so she was satisfied. Mr. Bingley was not at all satisfied with Elizabeth Bennet's acquittal of Mr. Darcy. He confronted his friend after the supper. "I say, Darcy, you are more than usually severe this evening." Darcy squared his shoulders in indignation.
I am here, as you requested, though Richard and I might have done better to remain at Netherfield this evening. I wish to expose Georgiana to a greater share of society as much as I desire my cousin to return to his former infuriating joviality, but an assembly on the first night—" His voice trailed off, and Darcy brought his fingers to his temples. The whole evening was one giant headache to him. "That is just what Miss Elizabeth said," Bingley observed, "but it is a paltry excuse, far too generous of her." Darcy grew even more tense. "I beg your pardon?" "Oh, well, I told her that Georgiana remained at Netherfield tonight. In fact, I promised I would bring her to call at Longbourn tomorrow. And I may have mentioned your cousin's situation, and your endeavours to restore his good cheer. Luckily, I also mentioned your natural reserve, and in light of all this, Miss Elizabeth insisted on taking no offence at your slight, though Miss Crawford seemed a little less forgiving." "Offence at my slight? I have not the pleasure of understanding you," Darcy replied, bristling at his friend's indiscretion. To have his sad story spread about the neighbourhood so immediately was an indignity Richard did not deserve, even if his melancholy was impossible to conceal. "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me," Mr. Bingley said in a deep voice meant to mock Darcy.
"Shall you deny that you said it?"
"I shall not deny it," Darcy replied, irritated by the rush of chagrin he felt. "It was a comment I made privately to Richard and your sister. It was not my intent for Miss Elizabeth Bennet to hear it, and I dare say the only reason she did was through her own mischief."
Darcy instantly conjured up the look of saucy impudence she had about her, the way her gaze had pierced through him when he had caught her staring at him over supper. "What does that signify? She has heard you, Darcy, and she has been far more gracious about it than you deserve. A less confident and clever creature might have been utterly humiliated to be spoken of in such a way, and in a room full of her friends and relations, who are my new neighbours, upon whom I should prefer to make a more favourable impression, by the by."
"Of course," Darcy replied, truly beginning to feel some remorse. "I shall apologize to her directly."
"No, no," Bingley said. "She has no wish to belabour the matter. As I said, she considered your circumstances, and has forgiven you already. Pray do not bring it up. Perhaps you may simply be more civil to her?"
"Certainly," Darcy replied. "I should always endeavour to be civil. It is as you say, I am much distracted. Miss Elizabeth seems a most clever and compassionate young woman, to have discerned so much with so little reason to forgive me. I hope among your other communications you informed her that I am not always so odious?"
Bingley laughed. "I shall leave it to your superior intellectual powers to convince her of the fact yourself. I like you very well indeed, and I have reason to believe Miss Elizabeth likes me. Therefore she ought to like you. I know you can be capable of deserving it. In truth, it is Miss Crawford who may require some special finesse. She was far more cross about it."
"Whatever has Miss Crawford got to be cross about?"
Darcy's indignation returned. "Well, the bit about it being a punishment to stand up with any ladies besides Caroline seemed to encompass Miss Crawford as well as Miss Elizabeth, and then they look so very similar that she supposed the barely tolerable bit might include her as well." Darcy could not help himself. He looked out across the assembly-room, to the place where the two women were speaking with Henry Crawford.
"There is some family resemblance, perhaps," Mr. Darcy admitted.
"They could be twins," Bingley insisted. Darcy had seen Miss Crawford on several occasions over the last week, with all the customary apprehension that usually accompanied any new female acquaintance in society. A single woman, no matter her own fortune,
must be in want of a wealthy husband, and experience had taught Darcy to be guarded. Still, he had observed Miss Crawford and taken her measure. He thought her genteel enough that he could not repent his sister's budding friendship with the lady, and certainly she was attractive, but he had no further good to say of her. The lady's attention to his friend made him wary, and he had learnt to trust such instincts. Miss Elizabeth Bennet, however— "Do you know, I never really looked at her," Darcy admitted. "I know it is no excuse, but I am sure I would have said the same of anybody at such a moment. Richard can be so provoking. But I can assure you, I do not really think so meanly of Elizabeth Bennet." He continued to study her from afar, and with a modicum of trepidation he began to find her quite fetching. "She is not so very like Miss Crawford," he said idly. Come, admit it. They are both angels," Bingley said in an alarmingly amorous tone. "Miss Crawford smiles too much," Darcy said. Bingley screwed up his face, but said nothing, and Darcy continued. "Miss Crawford is an inch or two taller, but Miss Elizabeth's petite stature, when paired with her fuller figure, produces a very pleasing effect. Her eyes are a shade darker, but brighter and larger, I think. Her hair, too, is a slightly darker shade, and her complexion is a little more tanned, as if she spends more time outdoors. In truth, I find her appearance far superior. I wonder you could find them so similar, though they seem to think the same. My aunt pointed it out when we were introduced. I recall we all agreed upon it, but now that you mention such little differences, I begin to see them myself," Bingley said, joining Darcy in openly gazing at Elizabeth Bennet from a distance. "She is radiantly beautiful, though I still like Miss Crawford very much," Bingley said. "I say they are both angels, identical or not." "One of them, perhaps," Darcy mused aloud, thinking of Miss Elizabeth's extraordinary perspicacity and generosity of spirit in understanding the reason for his distemper. She had forgiven him before he had asked it of her, or even endeavoured to deserve it. He would abide by his friend's request and not resuscitate the insult by apologizing to Miss Elizabeth this night. But Darcy began to think he might find some other way of making amends.